But thank you for hosting me, and it's a real pleasure to be here. This project that I'm working on is looking at Chinese impacts globally. My research in the past has been primarily on domestic Chinese law and politics in the environmental sphere, using climate and environmental policy to understand the way that China operates and doing comparisons primarily with the United States. So in the past, I've largely in my mind often been thinking about sort of the US to China comparison. And so a part of this project for me is to really get out of that framework and to think more about obviously the rest of the world that is having to live within a world that now has these giants marching around the world and having impacts in various ways. The other thing to note about my background is for about 7 years, I worked as a lawyer for an American environmental group in China. I helped set up the Beijing office for the Natural Resources Defense Council and worked on legal projects, environmental law projects in China. So that contact with regulators, with lawyers, with civil society groups in China really informs a lot of how I think about things. And also, I am well aware that at that time, my very presence in China, having the funding and the resources to kind of promote, frankly speaking, an American way of doing things within China was part of it's part of the global structure created by a world in which America is dominant, right? So it gave me the opportunities to be there to forward certain ideas and techniques. And what we're seeing now is that China is trying to do something quite similar. So that's what I'm quite interested in, to see whether, how China is trying to promote its ideas and to what extent are they having success. And part of that is about also reshaping ideas in ways that are consistent with their own interests and that meet their particular needs. Okay, so let me just start with a very broad framing. The debate, I teach in a law school, so the research in the law school for the last 20, 30 years has often been framed in terms of political systems. So really liberal democratic systems versus an authoritarian systems. So, here on the slide, I just have, on the left is the sort of Western framing, democracy, liberal rule of law. In the past, in the history, in the area of history, they talk about China as a sort of negative Oriental despotism, right? China is now trying to counter that, and supporters of China with sort of saying, look, we may not be liberal democracy, but we have, maybe it's a meritocracy or it's a system that can get things done. It's oriented towards performance, these sorts of things, but they're trying to make the case that their system is a viable alternative, or at least something that should be an acceptable alternative to liberal democracy. So this debate I've been very interested in, and in the environmental context, because the environmental situation in China was it's really fair to say it was a crisis, right? I was on the ground in the early 2000s and saw many of these situations, horrible air pollution, terrible water pollution and soil pollution, and local people being very worried about the health impacts and so on and so forth. And so in the broader kind of debate, China's environmental crisis came to be seen as an example, a big example of why their way of governance was not appropriate or a positive thing or a legitimate thing. And so what's been interesting, I worked in China from 2004 to 2011. That's much of that period was was known as China's 11th five-year plan period. China runs according to these Leninist five-year plans. And that was arguably, I've written about this, it was really the first time in which, from the top-down planning perspective, they started to take environment more seriously. Energy efficiency targets, pollution reduction targets. And then in the last 10 years, since Xi Jinping has come to power, they've expanded that and really doubled down on that. So at the time, we weren't sure if they would continue this, but they've clearly continued it, and they've attempted to broaden it and deepen it in a lot of ways. So I'll just show you a few slides. There's a lot of propaganda associated with this. So this is, an example. This is a typical, a lot of the leaders doing things in China. This is Xi Jinping planting trees and engaging in environmental activities. This is in Chinese, but this is something from the sort of Communist Party ideology promotion, and they've built in this concept of ecological civilization, embedded it squarely within the Chinese communist ideology, signaling to the population that this is a very important thing to the leadership, right? So the other signals, they've added this idea of eco-civilization to the Chinese constitution. So they've added into the law and the constitution, all ways to signal that they're taking this more seriously. And it's been having some impact. This is just some foreign headlines where, this is either, the main headline there is the Xinhua news agency promoting the idea of eco-civilization to foreign audiences. But on the right side, you have some foreign commentators also sort of taking that idea and commenting on it in a positive way. So this is really an example meant to highlight the fact that they are trying to take that ideology globally as well, and it's having and global actors are interacting with that ideology. So I'll very briefly just talk about this. What the view of China from outside is often of a very unified top-down state, right? And the general direction of political science and legal and sociological studies often is focused on the fact that the system is quite fragmented, right? And that there's a lot of contestation between different forces within society. So what I was witnessing in the early 2000s was a period in which there was contestation by different parts of society to try to expand the importance of environmental protection. Before the 2000s, as might be expected, China was quite a rather poor country, and they were very squarely focused on economic development. They did pass environmental laws and things like this, but largely they didn't seem to be taken seriously. Development was always took priority, which is, of course, also not unfamiliar to any country that is going through a development stage. But in the 2000s, what was interesting, China enters the WTO in 2001. Their economic growth expands quite substantially. And there's discussion. What's interesting is to understand why the leaders started to take environmentalism more seriously. In the 10th five-year plan, they start talking more about the developmental limits of environment. So they were having power shortages. They were growing too fast. They simply didn't have enough power. They were worried about not having enough resources to continue growing, and development was key to the leadership legitimacy. And so, even at this time, one-child policy is considered in the neighborhood of an environmental policy, right? Westerners would not tend to think of that as an environmental policy, but the origins of that come from kind of Western debates about the population bomb from the 1970s, these sorts of things, right? And so that developed into the 11th five-year plan, where they start to think, well, let's promote efficiency, let's promote pollution reduction. These are all in the name of avoiding limits on development, energy security, but they and minimizing social stability. Right, there's a lot of protests all over the country every single day about pollution. But they also start to think, well, are there opportunities beyond that? I would say those things I just mentioned are in the nature of sort of risk management, right? But then they started to think, can we take advantage of this for economic development purposes? So they started to promote around this time industrial policy for electric vehicles, renewable energy, these sorts of things. And so that's quite interesting to think. You think of that maybe 15 to 20 year period, right? These days, you all are familiar with the debates about China's dominance of clean energy supply chains, right? This sort of began 20 years ago, right? And it was inspired by the fact that they were worried, they were needing to import more oil, more energy resources, that is a security risk, and they're worried about being too vulnerable to global markets. But they also saw it as it's an area that the West was not taking seriously, right? In the U.S., the direction was not towards clean energy or change. America was dominant based on a fossil fuel system. There was no real reason for America to change. I was part of the environmental battles, and we were largely getting sort of beaten back in that period, right? The oil companies were very effective at beating back the climate and environmental interests. But so if we, part of the reason I'm in Chile now is because of the policies that began 20 years ago, right? That start to create the demand for batteries, for electric vehicles, for clean energy. It creates the Chinese companies that make wind turbines and solar panels. And I've been traveling around Chile and seeing. I was just up in Calama area and saw all the solar farms, the wind farms. I saw the lithium mines that are sort of the heart of this debate. And I think the leaders also at that time were starting to see how this could be a benefit to their telling a global story about China, right? Because again, to go back to my first slide, the rhetoric from the West was a very negative one towards China. This is not a system that the Western world thinks is appropriate, is legitimate, and China is trying to find a way to revise the story to get greater acceptance of their story. So I'm going to skip that slide, and so that's the domestic context. But in the last 20 years, you've also seen China going out and engaging with the world much more, and in particular, the last 10 years, we've seen a real acceleration of this and a much greater confidence. And China's companies are just much larger, and they have a sort of market logic as well as there's the political dynamics behind their going out as well. I know Ignacio has written a lot about this. We've had a chance to talk about that. And so as they're going out, again, I've been very interested in my work in this issue of Chinese legitimacy, right? The Westerners sort of fundamentally have treated the Chinese model as basically less legitimate than democracy because it doesn't have the system isn't generating its approval from the vote and public approval and that sort of thing. And so, and if you look at, this is from the Pew polls, quite negative views about China, especially in the last few years related to COVID, their COVID policy, as well as human rights issues. So those are driving a lot of the negative opinions. But at the same time, there's variation in the polling, right? Parts of the world that are not necessarily as closely aligned with the U.S. and Europe just exhibit a more ambivalence, I guess. And so part of the reason I came to Chile was in my classes in Los Angeles. I teach a class on China and the international legal order, and it tends to have students from all over the world. And I always found that the American students, the European students, the Japanese students, all tended to have a fairly similar view of China, sort of skeptical, worried about China's rise. And then students from the other parts of the world, including I've had a few Chilean students, tended to exhibit a more open attitude towards China. And so that got me interested as to sort of exploring that question, if that was a broad-based opinion. If so, why was that the case? But I present this slide really just to highlight the fact that if we believe that China, as they go out, part of their mission is to try to enhance global views of China, to increase their global legitimacy, and with the purpose of sort of reducing the friction when they operate in the world, right? Reducing the transaction costs in the world, they have a serious challenge ahead, right? There's a lot of negativity. But what I think is interesting in the environmental area, because this is an area I've worked in for more than 20 years, is that within China, they've moved from a situation where the story is entirely about environmental crisis and their inability to improve the environment to a more mixed picture. And in the sense that in the last 10 years, they've managed to make gains on air pollution. They've been successful. And despite the challenges with and questions about the accuracy of domestic Chinese information, air pollution, for example, is one of those things that can be verified by NASA satellites, and you can tell that there really have been improvements. China's been getting praise for essentially reducing the cost of clean energy, right? Their industrial policy on clean energy, which has led to trade disputes with the United States and Europe, has also reduced solar costs by 90%, wind costs by, and battery costs by significant margins, making it feasible for us to do a clean energy transition if we, for those countries that want to. And so, again, I'll go over this slide quite quickly. In the international stage, what we've seen is that up until the early 2000s, largely China had been taking, these trends sort of follow behind the domestic trends, right? That, from the 70s to the early 2000s, safe to say China was sort of, and this is a very broad generalization, but they were largely learning, starting, from the 80s on, they were starting to participate, learning about global affairs, and often taking a more defensive stance, asserting positions to protect sovereignty, promote common but differentiated responsibilities. In the environmental context, the responsibility of the developed countries to take the lead and to fund and support the developing countries. And they often use the international context to gain funds and to get training and information, these sorts of things. And it was really, my view, in the 2000s, it really, the years leading up to the Copenhagen Climate Conference, you saw China continuing to take this defensive view, but at the same time, their growth was so large that their emissions passed, they became the #1 greenhouse gas emitter in about 2006 or so, and their economy was obviously growing. And they were starting to get a lot more criticism for only taking that defensive stance. And so, domestically, you were also seeing those trends I mentioned earlier, that they were starting to develop more affirmative policies to increase energy efficiency, reduce pollution. And so that, in combination, I think, with the global pressure and the damage to Chinese reputation, in the early 2010 and beyond period, they begin to take a more proactive stance. And as part of that, you see that in the environmental diplomacy context, the international kind of environmental conferences, but you also see them start to use this environmental rhetoric in a broad range of activities. So in development aid, in economic statecraft, these sorts of things. And so you can see, I mentioned on the right side, some of the motivations in using environmental policy abroad. Part it's about securing natural resources. It's also about growing export markets and finding places for outbound investment. But it also has diplomatic and sort of reputational benefits. And so the book I'm working on now will look at this, and it's meant to describe, well, what is the content of this idea of environmentalism that China is promoting, right? It's one that's very developmental, right? It's very closely tied to economic development in a way that if you're a more pure, I guess, Western environmentalist, I think it would be, there are areas where this doctrine will conflict with what the environmental activists are calling for, because it's very much environmentalism in the context of development. I want to talk in this book about the tools that China is using, right? They're promoting their ideas in the environmental conferences, in UN development institutions, and they're now much more active in having environmental activities in development aid and in a variety of regional bodies that are not squarely about environment, security bodies and economic development bodies. And then the last part of that book will be about the promotion of this idea of a green belt and road. And the reason I'm here this week is to explore the possibility of Chile as a case, one of the case studies, because of the global debates about lithium and China's investments in the energy sector and their sales of clean energy technologies. And then finally, in the book, I intend to talk. The playbook is about what China seems to be doing, right? There is clearly a strategy, and there's lots of different Chinese actors who are living within that global government strategy. And there will naturally be fragmentation and not always a direct connection between government policy and what the local actors do. But as we've seen in China domestically, there can be sort of leakage or fragmentation, yet the overall policy still achieves many of its goals. And so the last part of this book will be about sort of where China is seeing support and where are they getting resistance, right? Because I think what's interesting is we're seeing support for China in a variety of ways. Even in my week here in Chile, I see interesting sort of different areas of support for what China is saying. So clearly from the economic actors, right, the lawyers and the business people I've talked to see the business opportunities, economic opportunities related to China's engagement. But even in talking to environmental groups, China's talk about support for global South interests and their opposition to sort of Western dominance of the debate is appealing to even the environmentalists. So they're finding traction in different parts of society, which is quite interesting. And so this I won't say too much about, because this I'm sure you may know more about this than I do. But what led me to come to Chile was these very headline driving investments in Chile and in the Chinese company's purchase of shares of SQM, Chinese state-owned enterprises buying parts of the energy system within China. And then you have that sort of Chinese activity, and then it's interesting to match it with what is the US doing, right? So what people I've spoken to down here have mentioned, the US Southcom commander came here and is sort of trying to warn the countries away from engaging with China, and has been helping US companies to try to sign deals. People have mentioned being, not have mentioned Mike Pompeo's 2020 comment that you should choose sides, right, between China and the US. People that I've spoken to so far seem to not take that comment in a very welcome way, and not surprising, right? And so this is the context in which we're operating in, right? The US sort of taking that very kind of China as threat narrative, and China coming in and offering sort of economic and other types of benefits, right? And so what I'm interested in, and I'm still at the beginning of this research, is how our countries, and there's going to be great variety among countries, right, depending on their situation, how they deal with that engagement, right? Because there's risk in the sense that U.S. policy, for example, right now threatens to create a lot of barriers, right? So just for example, American trade sanctions on Chinese solar is damaging to clean energy transition in the United States, in the sense that it raises costs, right? And that will surely slow the transition. For global South countries, it will be interesting how they navigate. I think there's a lot of discussion in a lot of countries about how to hedge between these two great powers. On the China side, I think a lot of countries are welcoming Chinese investment because of the economic opportunities there, but also unsurprisingly cautious about the potential risks that are being raised by the U.S. and by people in other segments of society. And so just some initial thoughts right now. I think China is facing an uphill battle in building legitimacy, but it's making inroads in various ways, as I've referenced. Global environmentalism is one framing or ideology that captures critical aspects of Chinese soft power construction, economic statecraft, and diplomacy. So the rhetoric of Chinese global environmentalism is a way to frame and help try to make people understand what they're trying to do and to tell a story that's positive. And whether that story captures the global imagination still remains to be seen. The other issue is just on the question of whether that vision is sufficiently environmental is one that would be up for a lot of debate, certainly in environmental circles. I think if you're talking about the clean energy transition, China's investment in that area is a good thing. It's a positive thing from the environmental perspective. Arguably, Chinese industrial policy in those areas has led to American industrial policy and European industrial policy, for example, right? America for many years was not acting on this and not supporting clean energy development. But now we have several pieces of legislation, including the Inflation Reduction Act just recently, that now add substantial support. And a big part of it is because Americans are worried about China outcompeting the United States. But in other respects, what I'm learning about the Chinese experience in Latin America is that there's a lot of criticism, more so in other countries than in Chile. It seems that there haven't been scandals with the Chinese investments in Chile that have been present in other countries where through hydropower projects or maybe development loans that are considered too coercive, these sorts of things. But again, these are just initial things that I'm grappling with right now. And so some of the questions that I have right now is I'm trying to think through what the Chilean case engagement with China can tell us about Chinese motivations as they go global, and to better understand also the impacts of China's going out on countries like Chile. Is how do people within Chile perceive the Chinese engagement? Is it a positive thing? Is it viewed as a risk? These sorts of things I'm trying to understand. What the preliminary research that we're seeing around the world, often places like Africa, is that there often are splits within countries, right? Some parts of society benefit, other parts maybe don't. So how does that play out? And how do countries engage with China? How does China adapt to that dynamic as they understand it? Right. Another issue that I'm very interested in is how China's opportunities in the world are in part affected by the behavior of the current great powers, right? Largely the US, but also the European powers. To the extent that they have done, though the US, for example, has behaved badly in the past or done poorly in these countries, that certainly gives China a sort of benefit in the sense that the US rhetoric about being the defender of all things good in the world doesn't ring true if the US engagement in these countries has been a negative one in history, right? Historically. And so that would also naturally explain the dynamic of being sort of welcoming to China, despite the way that the US and the Europeans have tried to frame this. And then again, the final question is, what are the implications for Chile and the world, right? Americans and the US-dominated multilateral institutions, there's been a long, multi-decade sort of advocacy campaign, for example, against the World Bank or the IMF to try to add conditionality, right, to improve the environmental performance of these investments. And there's been some success on that, right? Things that started in the 70s, 80s, 90s now have led to changes in those institutions. China is now coming with a less conditional way of engaging with loans and investment. And so what does that mean for the environmental conditions in other countries around the world? So that's another question that I'm exploring in this research. And so just a final couple things, random observations as I've been here in China. So I've been trying to take the electric vehicles on Uber. And so Ignacio saw that I showed up in this was a Kia, a Korean electric vehicle, but a few times I've taken them, they've been Chinese electric vehicles that picked me up. So for an American, that's unusual because there are no Chinese cars being sold in the United States. On the issue of Chinese soft power, this was just an anecdote from my hotel. I'm staying at the Sheraton, and I noticed a lot of Chilean teenage girls waiting behind a gate for somebody. And I said, "Who are you waiting for here?" They said, "We're waiting for Jackson Wang." I said, "I don't know. Do you know who Jackson Wang is?" "Oh, you do? Okay." So I didn't know who Jackson Wang is. So he was in concert here last week, right? So you both know Jackson Wang. Okay, so this is Jackson Wang, a Chinese rapper, singer who went to Korea and joined a boy band and now is known as a rapper. And I Googled him a little bit, and there are articles about him being very pro-China, so sort of nationalist positions, criticizing critics of China. So I thought that was quite interesting, just as an example of soft power that a lot of kids will be listening to him and will see his views on China, and you could see that you could imagine this playing some role in improving Chinese soft power. And this is a van I saw on the streets of Santiago last week, a very sort of negative example maybe of how American soft power is not as strong as it could be in Chile. An anti-Trump van I saw on the streets last week. Okay, so thank you for listening, and those are just my some initial thoughts. I would welcome your questions and thoughts, and I think it'll be very helpful for my research project. Thank you.
Many thanks, Alex, for sharing with us behind the reporting, sharing with us your preliminary thoughts regarding your research project. Before sharing a Q&A kind of session, we would like to invite Professor Johannes Renner to make a few comments regarding your presentation. Professor Renner, he's also a professor at the History and Geography School of the Universidad Católica de Chile, and he was also a member of the Center of Asian Studies, and he was also a former director of the center. So thanks, Professor Renner. Whatever you want, you can start.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. That was a fantastic talk.
Thank you so much.
I really enjoyed it. I had the opportunity to read some of your publications lately, and I found them as well very, very enlightening and very, very clear in terms of analyzing the last few decades of Chinese environmental policy and law. And therefore, I would like to highlight first the period of the first decades of the new millennium. Would you refer to that? And I was also fortunate or unfortunate to visit China in the late 90s and starting 2000. So I had the opportunity to experience those events of air pollution, which were really unimaginable to me before going to China. And so I think it's really important that you highlight the merits of that decade. Also, perhaps I don't know enough about the inner structures of Chinese policy, but to me it was quite important to see how during Hu Jintao's government these environmental issues were implemented in the public discourse, were implemented and recognized as a problem that might put certain limits beyond the classical limits of growth in Western society as well discussed, which were in general regarding to natural resources and have this correlate in demographics, with reference to the Malthus perspective on population growth and the consumption of natural resources. But I found it very interesting that during the government of Hu Jintao, slowly China apparently stepped away from the old perspective that as a country, they were claiming that they are a developing country, therefore not responsible for global issues and not able, but also not in the position in terms of ethics to start cleaning up the mess that industrial countries made in the last 200 years. So that was a quite common discourse. You have to clean up your own mess, and we have to try to look for economic growth first of all, and afterwards we can see other issues.
Yeah.
So I found that notably how quick this discourse changed at the beginning of the 2000s. So I found this moving from discourses around resource shortage to discourses around environmental responsibility. More looking towards domestic issues during Hu Jintao, but probably laying the ground for that for the concept of ecological civilization you mentioned, that which is as well incorporated in the constitution. I will come back to that issue of ecological civilization in a minute. What currently is changing in public perception as well, I believe, is linked to a different position of Xi Jinping in terms of global aspirations, geopolitical aspiration, which become more and more evident. Geopolitical issues before, at least from our perspective, were mostly linked to the particular situation of Hong Kong in the 90s and of Taiwan and some issues regarding maybe to the province of Xinjiang, or issues which are mostly related to China itself and its relation to different territories which are in dispute. But that currently, at least from the perspective, from a Latin American perspective, is changing. And Chile had a very particular situation that we had a extremely straightforward relation to China, which made the discourse on mutual benefits not only an official narrative, but very, very clear and very it became very relevant for our economy. So it's as you mentioned before, the positive view on China, from my perspective, is clearly linked to that straightforward relation we had with China. And obviously, you made reference to that, to asking Chile to take sides. And that was not well received in Chile. And that's quite obvious. It has been only 50 years since the military coup. So you can clearly take the position in Chile and say, well, should we trust one giant who did have a very questionable, or some say very destructive impact on Chile, and not the other one. And the other one, until now, had only a positive relation with us in terms of trade and nothing else. So that fits very well with the current position of China, saying, okay, we will now take responsibility on a global level in environmental issues. That is again a new possibility for Chile. There's no question about that. And so in terms of symbolic legitimation, as well as in terms of the performance-based legitimation, which is a discourse looking inside China, but we have it also on a global level, at least if you look at it from here. Nevertheless, there are from my perspective, currently some challenges which appear to be rather new in Chile, looking at lithium. You got this again, this argument: why should we sacrifice unique ecosystem to clean up the mess that others caused? Yeah? So you got again this argument: we are very small, we are very peripheral in certain senses. Yeah? So we should protect our ecosystem, and if all the other big countries did this mess, they should clean it up, and it's not our responsibility. So that's coming again. You have also a different view on this ecological civilization, because ecological civilization in the end is linked to the idea of civilization, the idea of progress, the idea of economic growth and development linked to environmental issues. And in Latin America, there is a certain movement towards rather post-human stance, to some perspectives making reference to ancient concepts like buen vivir, which is making reference to the it's different as well-being. It's much more related to the relation of the subject to nature. Yeah. So those are certain perspectives which are quite different in terms of their environmental relevance than the view of ecological civilization. And that links as well to the importance of indigenous people. In the case of lithium, we have conflicts with indigenous communities in a dimension which was usually not the case in copper mining, because copper mining is in rather empty areas where are very little people living. So the impacts are are not direct, are derived from the use of water, etc. Yeah? And in the case of lithium, we have very direct impacts. And finally, just because you also finished with several thoughts, I would also like to make two reference on the scandals you were mentioning, that in Chile there are not yet important scandals with China. I completely agree. Yeah. Nevertheless, I see there is a certain problem, or there might be a certain problem with the investments in power networks, because Chile, as a small and open country, obviously always has the problem with oligopolistic structures. And so a very big economic agent is causing a certain level of fear. Yeah. So it might be really important what will happen in that areas in the next years, because if there would be some situation where you can clearly say, okay, this huge Chinese agent is now taking advantage of its dominant position in the market, then quite quickly the perspective may change. And secondly, there is currently a case which might be of interest in the salmon industry, with huge overproduction of a company which was bought by Chinese investment, by a Chinese company. So that that overproduction exceeding by far the permitted quota was caused by the Chilean owner, but it's quite doubtful if the Chinese investor knew, or they are claiming that they didn't knew that, but it's at least doubtful. So there is the first of these very critical perhaps scandals that might change the perspective of Chile on Chinese stance towards environmental issues. So again, thank you very much. Your talk was really great. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for your comments. That was really helpful.
Thank you, Professor Renner, for your comments regarding Professor Wang's presentation. I think now we can start with a few questions. I don't know whether Nicole or Corky have any, or we can also ask whether people joining this conference online, if you want, you can make other questions you may have using the chat box function. Then we can help you to address them to Alex.
May I ask something?
Please, yes.
Thank you, Professor and Johannes, for your comments, the topics. I have two questions. The first is the Chile as a case. if you can go deeper in your idea, how you are gonna discuss in your book, the Chilean case, especially the lithium industry.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts? As you know, Tianqi purchased 30% of SQM, and there's some tensions between the local authority to remove some limits to acquire more of that company.
Yeah.
This is the first question. And the second one is that you mentioned that China is trying to construct a world more amenable to its interest.
Yeah.
If you can explain more about that, what is that idea of more amenable?
Yeah.
What does it mean?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. So on Chile as a case, I guess the first thing to say is right now I'm still thinking about how to go with the case. In the lithium context, for example, it's been such a hot topic in the news. There's lots of headlines about the Tianqi purchase. And it's a concern in the U.S., right? The government is viewing that as Chinese sort of, another example of China sort of gaining control over part of the supply chain. And so I suppose what I'm interested in finding is what is really the story underneath that narrative, right? So the narrative is about Chinese control of the supply chain. Certainly in the case of Tianqi, it's not it's a minority shareholding situation. So in some sense, I've been trying to learn, well, what are they getting out of that investment? And it certainly seems that there's some gap between what that investment really is and the way, at least, like I said, the U.S. government talks about it. So that's one thing to be mindful of, right? It's no surprise that the U.S. rhetoric will be more exaggerating of the threat, right? The other interesting thing is with Tianqi, I'm learning more about, I know there's a discussion about where the value in the supply chains is, right? So global South countries very interested in capturing more of the value, right? Chile doesn't want to be only a minerals export, right? They would like to be able to advance up the supply chain. And this was very much what China's complaint has been for years, right? So if you think of there was a lot of debate over, like Apple, the iPhones, everyone is talking about it. We know that so much China gets all the kind of, labor and pollution issues of making iPhones, but the profit, vast majority of it stays in the US, right? And so even 15 years ago, there was debates within China, can China capture more of that? So similar debates going on here. And interestingly, in the Australian context, China has Tianqi has an investment in a rock mine in Australia, one of the biggest in the world, the Greenbushes mine. And they have been very proud to mention that they have built processing plants in Australia. And they've been explicit about saying, look, this is an example of how we were adding more value to Australia, giving them more value. I don't know that story well enough. I'm sure there's lots of business logic to it. You want processing to be close to where, the materials are used and those sorts of things. So that may have driven it, but I think that's an interesting development in the Chinese company. If you're thinking about how are Chinese companies reacting to the local country's reaction, that's an example of maybe the Chinese company giving something a little bit more to the local country. So again, I want to investigate that more, but my purpose in the case study is to find out how much the rhetoric departs from what's really going on. On your question about more amenable, I'm not an international relations scholar, but I'm interested in this idea of constructivist theories of international relations, how you can socially construct what is perceived as a threat or a friend or a threat. And in that regard, clearly China is damaged by the fact that Western social construction of China is of China as a threat, right? So I was reading some testimony just this morning before I came here of a Naval War College, U.S. Naval War College professor who gave testimony to a congressional committee, and it's really just the testimony is really largely just listing U.S. Chinese investments in Latin America, and then saying, we don't know, but there's all sorts of risks associated with these investments, right? So he didn't really have any evidence of anything that had been done that was poorly done. But because of the social construction of China is as a dark enemy, all of those investments can be perceived as negative, right? In a way that American or Canadian investments may not be, right? And so that's what I mean by, China wants to try to change that view of China, right? And so that creates all sorts of frictions, in the willingness of someone to do a deal with you. That's at minimum, but also to just active sort of kind of legislation that opposes Chinese investment, as you're seeing in the United States and Europe. And so I think again the environmentalism is one, just China has a lot of favorable aspects of the environmental story now because of their investment in clean tech and these sorts of things that they can marshal to try to change the social construction of China, in a sense.
Thank you.
Sí.
Sorry. No, we have another question from the audience. Francisco Ordines, he's also a professor at the History, Geography, and Political Science School. He's now, I understand, he's based in the States. He's a fellow at the Wilson Center. He has a question that he can address. Francisco, whenever you want, you can just open your microphone and address the question.
Sure. Yeah, hello, Professor Wang. Thank you. Yep,
Hello.
I'm a professor in Chile. I'm currently a fellow at the Wilson Center,
Right.
soon to be back in Chile. I wanted to ask you about your experience with regards to the regulatory framework in China. I think that's still the black box. You mentioned the existence of a strategy, and I think that's worth studying because the empirical evidence, at least in Latin America, points in the other direction. It doesn't seem to be a clear strategy with regards to environmental standards from Chinese companies. It depends on the case that you choose. So if you choose cases like Coca-Cola, Sinclair, you'll find the story that supports the idea of Chinese being the predatory and very detrimental for environmental regulation. On the other hand, if you use recent cases like there's a Chilean case in the few weeks ago in which a Chinese company, Joyvio, denounced itself to the Chilean government for its own environmental violations, and that will give you a completely different story. So my sense, without being an expert in this field, is that there's a huge sense of adaptability from Chinese actors in their host countries. They simply respond to the demand of the environmental framework of the local country, and they respond to that. If they are given agency, they may go ahead and act in ways that may be framed as damaging for the environment. On the other hand, if they're kept into a clear framework, they behave no different from Western investors, and that's something that, for example, Boston University, which have done large studies, have found. I mean, if you look at large samples of companies, you have, of course, examples of bad apples, good apples, but in general, Chinese investors don't seem to be very different from American, Canadian, or European investors. So my question is, because that's something that we still don't understand in Latin America, I think that's still a niche to work on. What's the so how's the decision making done in China? Which are the key actors that regulate state-owned enterprises? How do they respond to stakeholders? What are the punishments if they don't comply? Those sorts of questions I think are still needed to understand all these broad possible of behaviors from Chinese companies, from the very, very responsible to the very detrimental.
Yeah. So that's a great question. Have you had a chance, by the way, to meet with Jennifer Turner at the Wilson Center? She runs the China Environment Forum.
Yep, we do. I do. Yeah, I see her often. Yeah, they're working on that issues as well. But I share with you something you.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, a couple of thoughts on that. I think, yeah, your point that Chinese companies are acting according to the local regulations is my understanding as well, based on the research that's been out there. And I think that idea that Chinese companies are behaving like other countries, you know, for good or bad, is also, you know, that's an important point that I think, again, departs from the way that, you know, the government actors, the U.S. government actors are talking about this, or people who have been criticizing Chinese behavior. I think within the Chinese context, you know, they have a lot of very general policies about, you know, being green or doing well, but so far there's fairly little. All of those statements seem quite weak, that there's not really any enforcement of those things, and no real punishment for not behaving environmentally, short of, I guess, you know, what makes companies do what they do, right? The Chinese companies have clearly had a learning process as they've gone out, and even in talking to people about the Chilean context, I've heard lots of interesting stories about how Chinese companies have become more sophisticated relatively quickly over the last decade, and, you know, starting with sort of awkward engagements and getting to learn the local environment much better. And so, you know, another question is, well, what has made, let's say, Western companies who behave badly in other places, if the local institutions are weak, the only sort of accountability for these has been, you know, media or civil society groups, these sorts of things. And right now you're seeing a dramatic ramp up of focus on Chinese behavior from you know, media, NGOs, academics. You know, the type of research that I'm doing here is an attempt to bring some transparency to what's going on. And so I think the idea that the Chinese regulatory framework will have a lot to be able to control these companies, I don't expect that they'll have the ability to control these companies substantially, unless there's, you know, sort of, you know, if these companies get into scandals that then blow back, that look bad for the Chinese government, these sorts of things, then you can imagine in those instances, then there would be a domestic response. But as a sort of general monitoring matter, I wouldn't imagine that there would be a strong ability for anyone within China to sort of keep an eye on all of these different companies going out into the world. So I hope that was responsive, but
yes, thank you.
Maybe I think we can just like wrap up with like the final question or something.
Yeah.
Maybe I can make a short comment on your ideas, or you're questioning the role of SQM and TNT in capturing more value, or extending value chains. Just a suggestion, if you're not have done it already, look at the contracts between the states and SQM, which were signed before the investment of Tianqi, and as well a contract between the states, the Chilean state and Albemarle, which was signed in 2016. Because the very interesting issue there is that in the case of lithium, the obligations of companies are going far beyond what is the standard in copper. So in copper, recently, last week or 2 weeks ago, there was established a royalty of 1% of the sales value. I understand that will apply starting next year. And in lithium, Albemarle has been already paying 3.5% of royalty since 2016. So just as an example, how in between state and company there has been established in the case of lithium something that has been unimaginable, or the public discourse has been frequently about the impossibility of the state to ask for this kind of royalties because no one would invest if you would do that. But it's the case. It's already a reality in the case of lithium, and the Chinese investor did his investment anyway. And the second point, the value chains in the same contracts, there is established that a certain percentage of production has to be sold locally, domestically, to a preferential price. So that's why there are hopes or expectations that the Chinese counterpart, as they are involved as well in the production of batteries, they should install battery production. It would make sense. That's why there is this. Just a suggestion to look into those contracts.
That's a great suggestion. Thank you.
I would like to make a final short question to you, Alex. You're based, you're an American professor of one top university there, and you're very familiar with what's happening there in terms of the discussion of Chinese engagement in Latin America. As you said before, there's always a big criticism regarding everything, or mostly everything, China is doing here in Latin America, either from a political perspective, trade, nowadays investment. And you mentioned now that the BRI policy is also greening. My question would be, besides reacting negatively, China's president in Latin America, do you see, not in the academia, but mainly in the government sector in the US, that there is a concrete plan in terms of compete with this greening trend in Latin America and Chile? So, for example, there's always a big criticism in Chile in relation to America's reaction here, because they just complain, but they're very passive in relation to offer an alternative to Chinese engagement in the region, right? Such as the Huawei cable, the 5G cable, electric vehicles presence, nowadays the production or exploitation of natural resources such as lithium. So, how do you see what's happening in the not just in the academia, because you're an important actor in that, but in the government itself, in the US?
Great question. So I think the ability of Chinese companies to come out and invest a lot, it stems in part from policies domestically, right? So the industrial policy, the availability of financing, these sorts of things. And then there's just a general push to get these companies to go out and be active, as well as tighter regulation at home in China, right? So I think the overall idea of environmental regulation, China is not the first to do this, but the tightening of environmental regulation has been matched with an effort to push the companies to go out abroad and to transfer their capacity outside of China, right? And so they're shifting the production and investments outside of China. for the longest time, I think the Americans, one of the reasons I initially was interested in coming to Chile was I was looking at, one of my students had done a report about the visa contracting scandal.
Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting, that was a way that the US government would intervene, really just to block a Chinese investment. And then when you look at the Chinese investments in the energy sector, often it's American or Canadian companies selling for market reasons, right? Maybe their private equity investors wanted to take profits or something. And so it just shows you how there's quite different, looser connection between the government and companies in the West, certainly, right? And in China, there's more policy pushing companies to go out. What have we seen the U.S. government doing since Biden came in? I mean, obviously, who's president matters a lot, right? Under Trump, it was a completely different situation. There was a zero interest. They were anti-environment, really, right? They were trying to dismantle the environment structure. Under Biden, the initial moves seemed weak, but in part that's a matter of just time, right? They had conferences, so the Summit for the Americas in Los Angeles last summer, they framed it really as a mirror image of Belt and Road, right? China now is saying Belt and Road is about green, digital, and health Belt and Road. That's their focus, right? They're emphasizing. And the Biden meeting, they also listed green, digital, and health, but then also democratic values, right? So initially, it was just a rhetorical thing. They were just sort of saying, we do the same thing, but better, right? Like with better values, right? And they've been doing that generally. So there was the main international mining meeting in South Africa a few months ago. State Department officials were there, and we're just, without mentioning China, we're just saying, we American companies, we emphasize mining, but with ESG, and again, so just making a values play, which then, would naturally, as we've discussed, may draw a reaction of a cynical response, like, you're saying that, but have you shown any evidence that that's the way you really behave in the past? But I think where you now really see some real action is with this legislation that provides money behind, subsidies for clean energy transition in the United States. So now that you have a lot of money and loan guarantees and things like that, companies are going to start to do things not only within the U.S., but they're going to be looking for ways to invest with, there's support for greater activity around building a supply chain. There's not only American, but also sort of friends of America as well. And so if Biden can stay in office for another 4 years, right, I'm terrified of our next election, what will happen, as you see all the news about this, but hopefully Trump does not win, right, again. So if he stays in for another 4 years, then you'll see these policies get a little more time to expand, and then you may see some better continuity. So, but this is one of the structural dynamics. If you look at the Chinese actors, let's say like the chief climate negotiator, he's been around since the 90s, right? He was the head of the environmental agency in the 90s. There's this continuity of the same people, which that is not necessarily always a good thing, right? Like a official staying in for 20, 30 years can sometimes be very bad if they're doing the wrong thing. But in the Chinese case, that continuity seems to have benefited, that you have this long-term memory, this long-term consistency of policy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, sí.
Sí. More of a comment than a question. Thanks a lot, Alex, for the talk. I also found it very, very interesting. I learned a lot. I told you before, I'm an international relations scholar.
Yeah.
And I completely buy your arguments,
yeah.
and like the outline and the story of the book. I just had two thoughts on it, and
please.
Maybe that's of any use. When you talked about the issue that Jorge asked about, making the environment more friendly or more amenable. I know quite well the debate and research on China at the UN, and sometimes the debate is about the charm offensive or China trying to show that it's a responsible international citizen.
Yeah.
And I know quite well the case of peacekeeping, where China, it's sort of a puzzle because peacekeeping, at the moment that China started to buy into this global policy or global practice, it was quite a liberal model. So it was China getting into the liberal model of peacekeeping. And since they're more present, well, trying to shape policies, obviously. This is a case where you have PLA interest in operating, right?
Mhm.
But it's a very clear case where you don't have the intangible benefits, status, and being present at the UN and shaping global policies way much more strong. I mean, the PLA could find other ways, right?
Right.
Exercising or doing stuff. The story that you are telling seems to be one where these tangible interests, economic interests, and well, seeing the limits, and then you have to do something for the environment, are much more stronger. But I guess at some point it meets this more general Chinese policy of very strategically gaining presence at the UN. And you even mentioned that influencing policies at UN agencies, for instance.
Mhm.
So it might be an interesting contrast where you have more tangible interests, but then at some point it comes together with this general Chinese strategy, very effective, it seems, to be more present and influence from that side.
Yeah.
And the other thing about that's a big question, and especially people that visit us from one side always ask, how do Chileans see China and how is it perceived? And obviously it's a big puzzle. But one thing that I think that is important, there are certain sectors within what you would call the political left that are anti-imperialist. So for them, being negative about the US doesn't mean being negative about China, which could also be seen as an imperialist power. But there's this very clear, it's a zero-sum game. So they don't like the US, but they like China. But then the big majority, this logic doesn't work. Even given the negative influence of the US at different points in history and in different sectors, Chile generally knows about the US, and that comes with trust.
Mhm.
You have people that were exiled during the dictatorship that lost family members. They don't talk negatively about the US, or I've never heard them blaming the US for history. Right. So that doesn't necessarily translate in being more positive towards China. Yeah. That said, in general, Chile has been, and that's very known, and a lot has been written about that, very practical in its foreign policy, its economic interests. Even this government until now, although they put human rights higher on the agenda, they haven't made a fuss with China. I think the only thing is was that they reenacted a commission or a bilateral committee with China that looks at human rights that existed at some points, but nothing public, no noise. And I know the European embassies here always complain that for them, sometimes it's difficult to meet a minister, but the Chinese, if they knock the door the next day, they get their meeting. But it's not the sort of trustful relation or the admiration that many in the Chilean elites feel for the youth.
So interesting, so thank you for those two comments. I think on your first point about the intangible benefits versus the more tangible interest, my presentation was emphasizing the chapter on economic statecraft, and that's probably the main reason I'm here in Chile. But sort of the other part, which I didn't really talk about much today, is more about China using the environmental rhetoric for the intangible benefits. Very much, at first it was really international environmental negotiations, but now broadly, linking it with sustainable development goals and melding the Chinese rhetoric of development with the international rhetoric in a way that really portrays China as linked with the global, or like key to the global discussion on development. And putting, anti-desertification aid in the UNDP or these sorts of things. So that's but that's very helpful to that comment. And your last point is interesting. I'm wondering what I should take from that. Is maybe just a sort of a framing way to think that there's that variation in attitudes towards China. And I think that's consistent with my conversations with people this past week, that I think what's seems clear to me is that at least the sort of high levels of clear negativity towards China they're much more prevalent in the US these days. It's much less so here. But I take your point on certainly the lack of admiration or trust. It's not a familiar dynamic. It's not like we're kind of all the same kind of dynamic. It's maybe practical, pragmatic, but also a little cautious.